The electricity that had tingled in Morton's spine died, leaving only weariness. This was the effect of exertion and excitement, and he glanced at his glass, noting that he had drunk nearly all of his brandy. Intemperance. He swallowed the last drops and set the goblet down beside the chessboard. It was time for bed. He slept uneasily. The bedroom was icy, and he had been too squeamish to crawl under the blankets, choosing instead to lie fully dressed on the eiderdown and cover himself with his overcoat. So perhaps it was unsurprising that in his dreams he was back in his dormitory at boarding school, part remembering, part reinventing the endless mischiefs and tricks that he had inflicted on other boys. When he awoke, as soon as he understood where he was, for the vivid aftermath of his dream hung like a fog in front of his eyes for a few moments, he thought of coffee, hot shaving water, and the merry fire in the breakfast room of his lodging house. He cursed. What had possessed him to stay here? Worse, to have agreed to rent the place. He swung himself stiffly off the bed and hobbled into the passage and down the stairs, groaning out loud. When he passed the window at the head of the staircase, his spirits lifted. The day was as clear as a diamond. The garden was silvery green in the dawn, the topiary a miracle of symmetry. It would, after all, take very little to make this place habitable. Good fires, clean sheets, a delivery of groceries, and the services of some respectable biddy, and then he would be, Morton smiled, the master of all he surveyed. He hurried down the stairs and out into the bright, bracing air. A minute later, he was sailing down the drive on his bicycle, in and out of the shadows of the trees, and then out onto the road that led into the village. And he had a most satisfactory morning. If the agent was taken aback that Morton was still as eager as ever to rent the black and white house, he concealed it admirably, and dealt so briskly with the papers that Morton left his office within a quarter of an hour. He even gave Morton the address of the charwoman who was in the habit of dusting the rooms every week or so, and she, with the glint of avarice in her eyes, agreed to provide food for Morton to heat up, and to manage his washing and ironing and any other domestic details that might prove necessary. Morton left her cottage and rode along the high street with a light heart, whistling. He had only foreseen a temporary sojourn here, a few months at most, until that unfortunate entanglement at home had blown over. But he might stay here longer, even permanently. He stopped at the post office to send instructions to his lodging house to have his things delivered. Then he went to break his fast at the inn. This time, he sat deliberately on the other side of the room, feeling a mysterious reluctance to encounter the gentleman who had spoken to him previously. But, it being market day, the room was packed with farmers and traders. And when the crowds parted enough for Morton to glimpse the shadowy corner opposite, he saw that it was empty, and even the chair and chessboard had been removed, presumably to allow a greater crush of people. He took a long detour on his journey back to the house, enjoying the exercise and the clean breeze on his face, and arrived back to find that, as agreed, the charwoman's son had left a meat pie and a pot of some Swedish-smelling pudding on the doorstep. Morton put them in the kitchen, and after a long battle, lit the range, hissing with triumph, when the sooty old beast finally bent to his will. A little while later, he had hot water. He performed his overdue ablutions as best he could, although he used a half-petrified bar of old soap. He stopped short at using another man's razor, and then, with a pleasing sense that he had done all his chores, he took himself into the library, lit another fire there, and began to peruse the bookshelves. Clearly, the previous inhabitant had not been much of a reader, for Morton took down book after book, all handsome editions of the classics, only to discover that their pages were uncut. He put them back and moved on, until he came across a little cloth-bound volume on local history, more a pamphlet than a book. He flipped through the pages, which were dotted with neat line sketches of notable buildings, the Guildhall, the church, and, of course, the black and white house itself. Built in the late 17th century by Sir Jeremiah Hope, of whom we know little except that he was known by his neighbors, in a play on his surname as Abandon. More recently, the house has become notable for its formal garden and elaborate topiary, created by the current inhabitant, Mr. Hope, M.A., in memory of his son, who inherited his father's passion for chess, becoming a prodigy before his tragic death at the tender age of... Morton yawned and flicked forward, but there was very little more on the house, and nothing of interest. He settled himself on a chaise longue and let the book slide to the floor. After his broken night, his bicycle ride, and the day's achievements, he was drowsy. He slept and dozed and slept again. Finally, he surfaced with a clear head and an appetite for dinner. As he got up, his mind running ahead to the meat pie, he hardly noticed the pamphlet underfoot. Going out into the passage, he shut the library door and forgot it entirely. After dinner, which was substantial, if not especially enjoyable, he retired to the parlor. He cleaned out the grate clumsily, getting ash on his trousers, and resolved to tell the charwoman when she came to make up every fire in the house. Then he poured himself another brandy, lit the candles against the gathering dusk, and sat down in the place he'd sat the evening before. It was then that he remembered the little book, and wondered whether he could be bothered to brave the draughty passage to go and get it. But no, there was the Chess Player's Chronicle, and the board set ready. Perhaps, if he was going to stay here for a long time, he should prepare a program of reading or correspondence to while away the solitary hours. In the meantime, there would be several meaty problems in the Chronicle to pass the time until he felt tired enough for bed. He took up the journal. By chance, it fell open on a page of problems, with their neat little hieroglyphics and checkered titles. At first glance, he could see a promising first attack, the bishop to take the rook, but there was a tempting pawn on the last rank of the board, which would take only one move to transform into a queen. He pulled the chessboard towards him to set it out. His heart stuttered. Another piece had been moved. Morton noted automatically that it was the Dutch defense. The bishop's pawn had advanced 2 squares, unbalancing the board. An aggressive but dangerous move, weakening the king. But that was by the by. There was no possibility that he had moved the black pawn himself. Last night he could blame forgetfulness or even drunkenness, but now he was sure, icily, sickly sure, that he had not touched the black piece. And yet it was there. The 2 pawns faced each other across the ranks, a riposte, as though an unseen opponent. He raised his eyes to the chair. His neck and head muscles were rigid, as if he were bracing himself for a shock. But the chair was empty. Of course the chair was empty. There was only the old leather with its cracks and valleys, the memory of limbs and fingers. Absence. He stared at it, reluctant to blink. The firelight flickered and played, and the shadows slid over the walls. The wood gleamed, smooth as water, dustless. Morton exhaled sharply. The charwoman must have been here. It must have been she who moved the black piece, or her son, perhaps, when he came to drop off the food. Yes, more likely to be the son. The charwoman was old and ignorant, hardly the type to play chess. But whichever of them it was a cheek, a damned cheek, Morton thought. He wondered fleetingly if the woman might have knocked the pawn with a duster. But the move was considered, a true reply to his opening, and it could hardly be a coincidence. It was definitely intentional, and definitely the son. He must have some rudiments of education. Morton clenched his jaw. He didn't believe for a second that the boy wanted an honest game of chess. Boys were nasty little beasts. No, it was to get a rise out of him. How dare he? Morton remembered a similar campaign at school, which had been successful. Too successful. Well, he was not going to fall for it. He considered the chessboard for another moment. Then, with a quick gesture, he pushed his king's pawn forward to the square beside its fellow, the Staunton gambit, offering a pawn as sacrifice, in order to launch an attack on the black king. That would show the little bastard that he wasn't scared. He sat back, rubbing his hands on his thighs, imagining the look of disappointment on the little boy's face when he realized that Morton had called his bluff. But that flash of satisfaction died almost as soon as Morton felt it, and a few seconds later he got up and paced, first to the sideboard and then to the window. He pulled the curtain aside, but the garden was in darkness. Clouds blotted out the moon and stars, and he saw nothing more than indistinct patches of deeper black where the trees stood against an obscure sky. Moving his own pawn would only encourage the child, the last thing he wanted to do. He tapped his fingernails against the glass, considering, but the noise rang out oddly in the quiet room, and after a moment he dropped his hand. The most dignified course of action would be to set the pieces back in their places, or, better still, to put them away, out of sight. The boy could hardly ask what had happened to them, could he? And Morton's own appetite for chess problems had lost its keenness. Indeed, the presence of the board behind him made his vertebra tingle like a hostile gaze. He swung around to look at it. It was absurd, but he heartily wished, that he had not played that counter move. The candles were burning low. Now the shortest one flared, licking thirstily upwards. As Morton watched, the shadows in the corner leant forward, avid. Then the candle flame shrank to a tiny bubble of blue and vanished. For a second, while his eyes adjusted, the stains on the chair seemed to grow solid, like a vessel filling with smoke, so that a casual glance might have given the impression that there was someone there. Something in Morton's insides tightened, and with a sudden resolve he strode across to the chessboard, reached for the box, and threw the pieces into its higgledy-piggledy. There were 2 compartments for black and white, but he ignored them. He pushed and pushed at the lid until at last something gave. Was it the head of a bishop snapping off? And it slid shut. The sound echoed off the walls. He had never stopped halfway through a game before, never begged for quarter, never admitted weakness. He felt it now, even though he was alone. A curious mixture of shame and defiance, and underneath, a creeping unease. Another candle dipped, threatening to gutter. He flinched. Somehow the thought of being left here, alone with the leaping firelight, was unbearable. He grabbed convulsively at the stem of the candelabra and went out into the passage. And although the skin between his shoulder blades crawled, he didn't allow himself to glance back. It took a very long time for Morton to fall asleep. He despised those who dwelt unnecessarily on the past, but for some reason he found memories of his school days running through his mind's eye over and over. He could see the boy who had been so terrorized by their jokes. Sims Minor, was it, or Simmons? And his wide eyes, the night he had asked Morton for help. He had been a weakling anyway. He should have dealt with their treatment of him as Morton had dealt with the chess set, sweeping it away disdainfully. That was the manly thing to do. And the accident, well, that was hardly Morton's fault. But nonetheless, Morton felt sticky and uncomfortable, and tossed and turned on the eiderdown, wrapping himself more tightly in his overcoat. But he must have dozed, because he awoke. There was a peculiar stillness in the air, the same stillness he had remarked when he first saw the house through the gate, as though the world itself was listening. He had the impression that some particular sound, now extinguished, had woken him. That or a movement inside the room, like a person coming within a few feet of his bed. It was not the latter, since when he sat up he was clearly alone. Clearly because the moon had come out from behind the clouds and was shining in through the window panes in squares of black and white. He pulled his coat closer about his shoulders and swung his legs over the side of the bed. The floor was icy under his bare feet, but he got up and padded silently to the window. He stood there, waiting for the sound to repeat itself. He heard nothing, not even the call of an owl or the rattle of a draught hissing through the gaps in the window frame. Could it have been the very depth of silence that jerked him out of sleep? But no, he was sure, almost sure, that he had heard something. He tried to describe it to himself. A low grinding, a deep resonant creak, halfway between wood and stone. He stared down at the trees, feeling a kind of vertigo that was not quite fear. The unearthly light, the dark shapes against the moon-drenched sky, the clarity of outline, the density of the shadows. He felt the space contract, so that for a sickly second the chess pieces were both huge and small enough to fit in his hand. He shut his eyes, but it made him dizzy, and he hastily opened them again. The shadows flickered against the pale glare of the moon, seeming to shift. He clutched at the window frame. He thought, only for an instant, he'd seen. No, nothing had changed. Nothing had moved. It should have been reassuring to see all the trees lined up, orderly, exactly as they should have been. But the pressure built in his ears, humming. If he saw one of the trees move forward, the pawn, say, advancing across the silver expanse of grass, then he would know he was hallucinating. He would almost be relieved. But this sense of waiting, and that weight in the air, the immobile trees, the game set out, it was unbearable, terrifying, somehow worse. And he couldn't move. He couldn't turn away. He didn't know how long he stood there, gazing at the pieces, waiting for something that never came. At last, he became conscious that the moon had dipped behind the house. A soft breeze was murmuring in the chimney, and his feet were numb with cold. He hobbled back to bed, and unexpectedly he dropped swiftly into sleep, exhausted as though from some great struggle. He was roused by knocking. He rolled blearily down the stairs and along the passage, rubbing his eyes, and wrenched open the front door. A small boy was standing there with a pudding basin and a parcel in brown paper. He thrust them towards Morton. "Empties," he mumbled. "What?" "My ma said to collect the empties." "You can have them tomorrow," Morton said, and started to shut the door. "You'll be snowed in tomorrow." Morton paused. In his half-asleep hurry to answer the door he had hardly noticed, but it was true that there was a new rawness to the wind, and the low clouds were flat and featureless. "All right," he said. "Wait here." A few moments later he returned with the empty pot and pie dish and held them out. The boy was shifting from foot to foot as though he needed the lavatory. He grabbed at the dirty crockery, shoved it into a knapsack, and turned to leave without another word. His haste, although not quite insolent, flicked Morton on the raw. He was paying the child's mother's wages, wasn't he? "I say," Morton said, "not so fast. You've been messing about in the parlor, haven't you? Well, you can jolly well stop it." The boy stared at him. "I ain't been inside," he said, after a pause. "Your mother, then. I'm not an idiot." Morton glared at him, but the boy held his gaze, his expression blank. "Tell her not to fiddle with anything, as she did yesterday. Just tell her to keep her hands off things, all right?" "She ain't been in yesterday either," the boy said. "She only cleans on Sundays. Sundays, there's nothing walking." "What?" But the boy didn't answer. He hunched his shoulders and let them drop again. Morton took a deep breath. "The gardener, then. There is a gardener, isn't there? He ain't got a key to the house. Only does the trees." "Well, whoever it is," Morton said, "if I catch them at it." The boy went on staring at him, chewing his lip. Finally, as if Morton had missed some opportunity, he turned away. He walked down the drive with his eyes on the ground, and when he had cleared the last rank of trees, he broke into a run. Morton watched the boy until he had slammed the gate shut and disappeared along the road. Then he turned back into the house, shivering. Now he had time to notice. He could smell the metallic tang of snow. Perhaps, after all, it was foolishness to stay here. Perhaps a room at the Swan might be more cheerful. But that would mean admitting defeat. He went into the parlor, slapping his arms against his body to warm himself, and knelt to see the fire. His hands were stiff and his head was aching. He fumbled for a long time with matches and sheets of newspaper before the fire eventually took hold. Then he collapsed onto the sofa. He might be coming down with something. He was neither hungry nor thirsty, although when he consulted his watch, he discovered that he had slept very late, and it was well past noon. A single flake of snow drifted past the window, pale against the gray sky. He blinked, wondering whether it had been a trick of his eyes. But then there was another, and another, until a whirling veil blotted out the low clouds. Slowly, Morton relaxed. It was comforting to be inside, beside the crackling fire where the noiseless storm swirled around the house. He sank into a kind of trance, watching the white dance of the blizzard, the almost shapes that blew and billowed against the window panes. This time, perhaps it was because it was colder outside than before, the groans and murmurs as the warmth spread through the room were louder and more distinct. The creaking of hinges, the pattern of knocking in the floorboards that sounded so like footsteps, the sigh of the chair. Then he glanced into the corner, and the air caught in his throat. There was a man in the chair, a malevolent, eager... Malevolent, it's not malevolent. Malevolent. Surely he was seeing things, but no, it was there. Perfectly solid, one bishop splintered at the neck where he had pushed it roughly into the box. 4 pawns were out of place, 2 white, 2 black. Someone had set it out painstakingly and played another move. Someone who had been in the house. Someone who was not the charwoman, or the gardener, or the boy. And it had not been there when Morton knelt to make up the fire. He sat very still. He would have liked to cry out or run from the room, but he could do neither. For a long, horrible moment, he thought he might never move again. Then at last a wave of anger came over him, strong enough to drive away the terror that had paralyzed him. He pushed himself forward and with shaking hands swept the set into its box, ducking for a pawn that rolled to the floor. Then he shuffled to the fire on his knees and dumped the box and its contents into the flames. The fire sank under the new weight, and horrified, he reached for the poker, but when it flared, leaping around the box, catching at the corners and gulping at the pieces that jutted from the top. Dark grounds and towers and horse heads were silhouetted against the red gold dazzle. Then they were gone, enveloped in flames, and the room was full of jumping firelight. Morton felt triumph flood through him. He sat back, breathing hard. Then he glanced into the corner, and the air caught in his throat. There was a man in the chair. A malevolent, eager, hungry old man, made of shadows and hollows. There and not there, withered and thread-thin but dreadful. A man whose only wish was to win. How Morton got to his feet he didn't know. He staggered to the door and into the passage. How he made his way blindly to the door and out. He never knew how he stumbled out into the snow, or whether he cried for help, or whether that terrible shadow man followed him. All he felt was the consciousness of his own powerlessness and an appalling, desperate panic. He had no time to wonder who the man was, or to care. All he knew was the awful burden of his mistakes, and the impossibility now of ever righting them. It caused little surprise that Morton did not stay in the black and white house. No one ever did. Since the old man died, there only a few strangers had remained more than a few hours under that roof, and all of them had left without notice and never returned. It was generally assumed that Morton, like the others, had found the atmosphere unwelcoming and had packed his things and made his way back to wherever he came from. And the local people, who were pleased not to concern themselves with the house, were equally pleased not to concern themselves with Morton. If it had not been for the snow, no one, not even the agent, would have given him a second thought. As it was, only Robbie, the charwoman's boy, questioned what had become of him, and he told such an outlandish story that his mother instructed him sternly to hold his tongue. It seemed that the next morning, when the storm had blown over and the sun had risen, little Robbie had ventured out to play. The world was glittering white, the sky blue and gold with winter sunshine, and he had wandered a long way, throwing desultory snowballs and wading through drifts. When he finally turned for home, his path brought him past the back gate of the black and white house. He paused, shivering, to look through the bars, and saw something. In the end, his curiosity overtook his habitual wariness of the place, and he crept forward into the dazzling space to look more closely. What he saw was the footprints of a man emerging from the front door, blurred by the wind and more snow, but still unmistakable. He had walked, run perhaps, in a straight line for a little while until he was between the ranks of the trees, and then, Robbie said, the tracks changed. They were jagged, zigzagging in broken lines as though he had gone hither and thither like a man in a maze, and now and then he had fallen and struggled again to his feet. If he had been running from something, it had left no trace in the white snow. But the strangest thing, Robbie said, was that the tracks ended so abruptly at the foot of one of the taller trees, as though Morton had disappeared entirely, taken by the Black King.